and welcome to this episode of For Your Consideration. Now, my name is Guy, and of course I'm going to be taking you through today's video, which is the Siege of Havenhold. Now, something to think about when you've got a weekend and you've got gaming coming up is the power of basically a large-scale battle or siege. Now, this could be in any kind of setting or system, and if you're unsure as how to run a siege, you can head on over to the videos Siege Part 2, which are in this channel, and I did earlier on, I think last year as a matter of fact, where we looked at the siege and the possibilities that the siege brings with it. Now, this particular demonstration that I'm going to take you through, the Siege of Havenhold, is a siege that we developed for people who supported our fundraising campaign to get the book going, the How to Be a Great GM book. And if you want to know more about that, look at last week's videos. We need your help to write the book. I believe we'll put the link down below where people could go and link up to a particular game, sign up for the game for free, and then they would help generate funding for the book. And at the same time, then we would send them this PDF of this particular siege. Having done it, though, we thought that it might be useful for you guys to be able to have a look at it and to see exactly how I plot out a siege so that you can do it yourself. And basically what it requires is it requires you to have a map. So I just happen to have a map. So this is Havenhold and surrounds. Now, what I've done specifically, I don't normally do this, but in this case it can become important for the players to be able to know distances and things, is I've put a grid onto it, a hex grid as a matter of fact, and each hex is about half a mile's distance, so you get a sense of just how far away things are. I used incarnate.com, by the way, to generate this map, and this was generated on the subscriber licensed version, which I think is $25 a year. Anyway, go and have a look if you haven't. So this map is Havenhold, and there you can see Havenhold in the very sort of middle leftish of the map, and of course all this area around it. Now, importantly, as far as I'm concerned, when you are dealing with a siege, is that the player characters, should not be involved very much with siege combat. And there's a reason for it. Siege combat is particularly dull. People basically sit around without much food or water or supplies, waiting for the enemy to attack. The enemy don't do that. They wait for the people being besieged to run out of food and surrender. So there isn't a huge amount of excitement that can come out of a siege itself. That means that when you are designing the areas around the siege, and I think I mentioned this in the video, you need to make sure that the areas around it are interesting and provide you as the game master with opportunities to have the player characters do stuff that will affect the siege whilst the siege is actually happening. Now, what's also important, depending on how you want to play it, and depending on your players, of course, is how the siege unfolds. So in this case, I've got my various locations. Havenhold is important, Loxon Keep is important, Wakthroughs is important, and Shalas, the lizard folk city, is important. So now I've made those names bigger and bolder. It also helps the players to understand what's going on. And of course the White Horse Inn I have also made bold, and there's a reason for that. That's basically where I'm going to start the siege story. As it plays out, my players will be based there. That's also something that's important to think about, is where are the players at the time of the siege. If you start the campaign and the players are in the castle already with the siege around them, that's exciting and that's fantastic, and certainly it is one way to go. Another way is to get the players' characters to be involved in seeing the siege unfolding as it goes along, and that is part of what the Siege of Havenhold is all about. So I have my setup. Now, with any good story, you need to have a setup of the current state. So I've done the write-up in terms of, okay, well, what is currently at Loxon Keep? What is happening at Wakthroughs, Shalas? What are those relationships and those kind of things? Then we start with finger trouble there, my apologies. We start with the invasion. Now, the dark black force in this particular instance, because I was giving it out to everybody who supported the book, I allowed you to fill in the names of the forces. Is it an undead army? Is it an orcish army? Is it an army of Klingons that are doing a terrestrial invasion? It's entirely up to you how you want to set it out. But the idea is that you list where the forces are. Now, in a siege, it doesn't really matter if the forces are equal or if they are in balance. Generally, the besiegers have the greater number. Why? Well, because if they didn't, the besieged should be able to break free and break out. It depends entirely on the siege, and there are instances where less number have besieged a greater number for various reasons. But generally speaking, the numbers should be very, very different. So what I've done is, if the players start at the White Horse Inn, at that junction on the road, they're going to see the Black Force approaching. And there can be all sorts of weird and wonderful things that happen at that White Horse Inn at that approach. You can have villagers rushing past, frantically trying to escape this invading army. You could have wildlife breaking out of Murrock Forest or Foyles Wood trying to escape as well. So there's those kinds of options that are available to you to set up the sense that there's this massive army approaching. And again, the idea here is that you want the players to invest in the siege. You don't want them just to turn tail, cast Dimensional Door, walk out and not be involved. So you need to set it up. Like a good story, you must have a good setup. So here you can have sneak assassins, vanguards, scouts engage the player characters at the White Horse Inn or wherever they happen to be. Maybe they're exploring the ruins of Targanii in the bottom right of the map, where then suddenly they encounter scouts. So you can give this foreboding, this impending arrival. You can play that up. Make it an entire adventure. You don't have to run this out. And that's the important thing with a siege. You don't have to run it out in one adventure. Play it out as a series of adventures which culminates in this entire narrative of the siege, rather than just the siege itself as being a single adventure. And you're going to see how I've built this so that there is not really a replication of the same type of adventure within this micro campaign, if you like. So you have your invasionary force and you have whatever adventure it is that you want to set up. Now this adventure could be completely unrelated to the siege. The player characters could simply have been heading to Foyles Wood or Loxon Keep because they're seeking treasure from a map that they've got from somewhere else. It really doesn't matter what that adventure is, but as they play out that adventure, you start to tease that this army is arriving. And by the end, of course, of that adventure, the army has arrived. And you can see the forces of Havenhold, the Blue Force, have started to assemble, as well as the few forces of Wakthroughs have developed as well. If you have been attentive as a game master and you have set up NPCs in your previous adventures that come from these areas, or that this area happens to be the history of one of the players' characters was from Wakthroughs or was from Thames Wood or whatever it might be. If you've set that up, that's fantastic. You can now have the PCs get invested in this because they want to protect something. So using your NPCs to maybe talk about Havenhold or to have some kind of link is really, really powerful. However, it is at this point that the players now have agency. They can go where they like. Do they, if they're at the White Horse Inn as our starting point, flee to the north, to Loxon Keep? Do they flee to the south, to Wakthroughs? Do they just head straight to Havenhold? It doesn't really matter where they're going because you have a plan of action. Wherever they go, it should be an adventure to get there. Now, I'm not saying they should just encounter scouting party after scouting party after scouting party. You can throw in micro adventures not in the way, but as they're going. So let's say, for example, they flee to Havenhold directly. They're going to run across the Grantham Plain and get there. What happens is, as they're moving through from Prodley Wood, this deranged bear, which has been enraged by this army, breaks free and attacks them, or it attacks a family and pulls the family, or if the ground opens up and this worm thing eats the family cart that's in front of them and they have to go and rescue the daughter. You can pad it out as much as you like. If you really want to play this up, that's a good way to go. Have them encounter NPCs that they can form basic relationships with so that it makes the siege that much more personal. You want NPCs in your siege because that's what it's all about. So the army now starts to invade. Our players have run off to Havenhold, and we've given them an adventure in between fleeing the giant army and arrival at Havenhold. Once they get to Havenhold, we now have a bigger scenario that is happening elsewhere. If they join the army and they journey with the army, that's absolutely fine as well. That's not a problem. They can go in and you can have some skirmish combat. They're not going to fight the entire siege in a single battle. That's not how it works. From that point, this is now where you can then enlist the players. You can recruit the characters. Call it conscription if you like. You have to serve in the army because you're in the area and we need you. And if you don't, we're going to execute you rather than the enemy. That opens up a whole different can of worms if your players are particularly difficult and they want to go off on their own route, then that's absolutely fine. But generally conscription will work, and with conscription you now have the power to send the characters where you want them to go, and this is important. So whether they fled to Wakthroughs or to Loxton Keep or wherever they happen to have gone, encountering a representative of the forces of Havenhold who can conscript them is sufficient to get them involved. So wherever they are, they can be conscripted, and that then gives you control over them. So now what can happen is, now you can start to say, right, I need you to go to Loxton Keep and take this important message to the commander of Loxton Keep that they have to hold the keep. They cannot let the keep fall. They then rush off to the keep, but perhaps the keep was abandoned. As I had written it, it was an abandoned keep. They arrive to find the relief force that's going to be taking Loxton Keep to have discovered that the keep itself is full of creatures of evil, there's undead that are living in the crypts or whatever. The characters now have to help to clean out Loxton Keep before the invading army arrives. So do you see how we're in a siege type of campaign, but we've already had very different types of adventures. We've had a rescue adventure, now we've got a clearance adventure where we've got basically a traditional dungeon crawl to try and make Loxton Keep as steadfast as possible. Should the players have somehow managed to avoid your conscription, there's this gigantic battle that's happening in the background, and that's really where it should stay. If they want to join in the battle, that's fine, but now you can conscript them and send them off to Loxton Keep. If they want to scurry about in Garga Sul Swamp for whatever reason, you can have the battle playing out in the background. Don't forget about it. Again, though, bring in individuals that are going to try and draw the PCs into the siege space. So an NPC who comes and begs them to go and find her son because he was dispatched with the force who was sent to Loxton Keep. However you want to play it, you've got to start to use the environment to drive the PCs to where you want to go. It is railroading, there's no way around it, but this is the story that we're trying to tell, this siege. So now if you look at how I've designed the enemy to invade, because I wanted the players to go to Loxton Keep, they are now stuck there, they have cleared out the keep, so now there is a siege moment, except that I don't yet want them to have this protracted siege. So it's a big battle. It's a battle showpiece to show off the enemy as to how powerful and how dangerous they are, but at the same time to allow the players to really get into the mix of the combat. Now, there should be no risk of Loxton Keep ever falling, although it should appear that way. What's going to happen is halfway through the battle, and you'll see it's indicated on the map, is that the black force breaks through the blue force near Wakthroughs, and that causes the whole thing to start to collapse for the blue force, so that the enemy no longer needs to take Loxton Keep, which is no longer strategically important. They can now withdraw their troops at any point. So let the players bash away at some of the enemy, let them get their teeth into the idea of the enemy, and then have the enemy withdraw. the characters are now told that there is another force that has been spotted near Cradden Fields. Cradden Fields is a lava swamp of fire type of space, which is a really interesting environment. You could send the players down to Cradden Fields to go and explore and see what that army, those scouts that have been reported, are actually up to. There's that option. So that's something that you can do. Now we've got a scouting mission, which is very different from the clearance mission or from the rescue mission. You see where I'm going with this. It kind of, the story tells itself as you start to plot out the movements of this army. Especially if your idea is what I had, which is to have the final set piece as the main siege. So I wanted to do all of the prelude stuff before we got to the actual siege. So now the players see that there is this giant army. Waffenwold farming community has fallen, and the forces have retreated back to Havenhold to have a final last stand. However, the final last stand is not going to play out as it is because we haven't yet had a really talky mission. We've had scouting, we've had investigation, we've had clearance and that kind of stuff, but we haven't had a talky mission. So this is where I then introduce the talky mission with the idea that because it's player characters, they're probably a diverse bunch. They're not just the humans of Havenhold or the whatever species you happen to have decided as owners of Havenhold. Because they were recruited, conscripted into the army, they are now dispatched from Locks and Keep, if they're still there, or from wherever they happen to encounter a representative of the Blue Force. It's up to you. They are now dispatched to Shaka Shalas. That is where they need to go. And they need to go there because they need to entreat the, in this case, lizard folk, a chieftain, to send forces to assist in the defense of Havenhold. This allows the player characters to have to go into the swamps, so you've got all sorts of wonderful swamp encounters that you can throw against them, but it also forces them to then have to try and negotiate with this lizard folk in Shaka Shalas capital city to give them troops and to convince the troops that they should participate in the battle. It's a wonderful opportunity for the players to explore negotiation, persuasion, deception, insight. Whatever they want to use is at their disposal. If they seem reluctant, you can give them a chest full of gold and just pay for the whole thing to happen. The lizard folk, of course, it's entirely up to you. It's your world. The lizard folk could demand a performance of combat prowess from the PCs in an arena, fighting a giant six-headed alligator. Or they could do whatever it is that they like to try and convince the leaders of the lizard folk to join this battle, because it's going to be a significant contribution from their behalf. Now, of course, that happens. The player characters now are free to return to Havenhold if they want to. They've secured, perhaps, the lizard folk alliance. And, of course, because you're the GM, it doesn't really matter what they do, even if they really balls it up. Try and figure out a way to bring the lizard folk into that combat, even if they are going to deceive the humans later and try and take Havenhold for themselves. Bring them into that combat. But it's going to take time for their army to assemble. And this is the important thing. It will take time. So what happens is our characters have now secured this wonderful alliance. We haven't yet had a sneak adventure, for lack of a more professional term. We haven't had a sneak and assassinate. And so that's what I've now set up. The White Horse Inn, which they originally started in, hopefully, or which they know about, is now the headquarters of the besieging army. Again, the player characters shouldn't be involved in the siege. Nothing's happening. The Dark Force has surrounded the Blue Force, and that's it. They're encamping, they're entrenching, they're setting up trebuchets and that kind of stuff. If the PCs really want to get involved, have them go and destroy some catapults, have them go and poison some food of the enemy troops, that kind of thing. Let them do harassment technique. But the army is simply too big for the player characters to defeat on their own. So they have to now go and try and assassinate the leadership of this Dark Force, of the Black Force. Try and assassinate them, and they're based in White Horse Inn. So now you've got that wonderful sneaking adventure that now needs to take place, and they need to go and do that. If they succeed, fantastic. But the leadership, of course, there's still one general on the battlefield who will keep the siege going. If they fail and they get driven off, they can retreat to Locks and Keep if they so need, or they can get word or see sight that the lizard army are now assembled and are heading towards the battle. This is where you are now heading towards your climax, and so hopefully the PCs will return to the siege where they can then help or hinder or do whatever it is that they need to do in a spectacular battle. What you can also do, I've jumped ahead too quickly, what you can also do is have the PCs return to Havenhold having successfully assassinated the big bad enemy, only to discover that there is a traitor. If they don't assassinate the big bad enemy, or if they arrive and they assassinate who they think is the big bad enemy, but it only turns out to be a dummy, a decoy of some kind, they will learn that there's a traitor in Havenhold. So now they're going to return to Havenhold to try and hunt out that traitor. Now we have an investigation adventure that happens whilst they try and root out who this traitor is. The siege is still happening in the background. Now the lizard folk army have arrived. So now there is this spectacular battle going on whilst this investigation happens. The PCs, of course, can involve themselves in the battle as you so decide, but the investigation mission is what is important. With the lizard folk arriving, the forces of evil are going to move away from the White Horse Inn. We don't need them to be there anymore either because, well, the mission to go and assassinate has been played out, and so we move into the final moment of the battle, which is where the forces of darkness are being defeated by the combined forces of the lizard folk and, of course, the blue force and the PCs. They must now be involved in this final battle where they can go and slaughter the general on the battlefield, where they can go and take out that kingpin with lots of battle and fighting going on in all different directions, in all different areas, and that's how they can really capitalize on that siege, so that by the time we get to the very end, the players feel as if their characters have been involved in this tremendous, grueling siege, which took all of their efforts at diplomacy, at sneaking, at investigation, all of that. It took all of that to break this siege. It wasn't just a slogfest. So that, for me, is what makes it very, very important in terms of running a siege type story, is that the siege itself is not really where the adventure is. It's everything that goes around it. And how do you bring that together? You bring it together by manipulating where the forces of darkness go. So by having done these 10 slides, or 7 slides actually, that just outline the course of the creatures by looking at the geography and positioning things in opposite and directly opposite positions, I'm getting the player characters to move all around my map. They haven't missed anything except perhaps for the ruins of Targanii, which, if they really wanted to, they could have started at perhaps. On Mount Khaldun, there's an ice giant infestation which they can go and try and deal with as well, just in case the players don't really want to get too involved. You can send them out that way as well. So it's about utilizing everything that you have to tell a story in this space. You've now had 6 or 7 adventures that are all very different from each other. They don't feel like they're routine. They don't feel like they're the same thing. They've all tested different parts of the characters. They've tested the different classes that the characters are playing, and has allowed, hopefully, each different character to shine in this great siege of Havenhold. So that, in a nutshell, is how I run a siege, and I hope it's inspired you to perhaps go out and make your own sieges, run your own games where you have something as complicated as a siege that goes on and keeps your players breathless until the very end of it. Until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of weekends.